Hello, my name is Jacqueline Mallory, and I am a program assistant with the DFR Lab. Thank you to our panelists for that essential conversation. Efforts to make the digital world an accessible, rights-respecting, and open one are incomplete without a truly international perspective. Similarly, you can't have democracy if 50% of the global population doesn't participate. However, information operations frequently use gendered and sexualized narratives to attack women, trivialize their accomplishments, and dissuade them from political participation. The absence of hate speech is not safety, and everyone, from think tanks to academia to industry, must do better. That's why this 360 OS, we are proud that 57% of our speakers are women. We have featured 10 female-led lightning talks highlighting research on topics ranging from the COVID-19 infodemic to the gaming industry, and we have hosted 6 panels made up of entirely female speakers. And with that, I am so excited to pass to Moira Whelan, the Director for Democracy and Technology at the National Democratic Institute and a non-resident fellow with the DFR Lab, for our next discussion, where we'll hear about the dynamics of gendered disinformation, its impact, and what can be done about it, from 5 women who work every day to combat disinformation and build a more equitable internet. Moira, over to you.
Thanks so much, and I'm thrilled to be here with all of you today. I am a big fan of 360 and of the Digital Sherlocks and all of your work, and excited that today we can enlist all of you in helping us solve this completely solvable problem of misogyny online. So I have an amazing panel with me today, a group of women who, this is the hill they will die on. We are all working to address this challenge. And they have done the work in advocating for an internet that is safe for women and have done the research on what we need to do to fix it. So before I turn over the stage, a bit of outlining for our guests, some of the issues that I know our panelists know, and that I think our participants also know, but will hopefully level set us on this conversation. Our goal today is not to spend a lot of time reviewing how big of an issue this is. Every one of us has done 50 of those panels, but instead to look at how solvable this problem really is. So misogyny online is a problem. It far outpaces misogyny online in particular, as opposed to in real life, outpaces the vitriol and violence that we see in everyday life. We also know that misogyny is weaponized, particularly against politically active women and other marginalized groups. And we'll talk a lot about that. And we have lots of research that tells us that this is a universal problem and happening in every region of the world and in every language. We also know that it is directly impacting the participation of women online. In fact, the very idea of being a woman online is a political act, as I'm sure Nina will get into. One of my favorite studies is done by Plan International. It was a survey of 14,000 girls globally who report being attacked online and already taking steps to self-censor. These are girls that aren't even old enough to vote. And that's pretty shocking when we all know that any activist needs access to the digital space to change their community or their country. But those are 14,000 girls. How does one of them become the prime minister of her country? And this is to say nothing again of the violence that's projected on politically active women that our panelists will discuss today. And finally, we're going to talk a lot about the tools we have to address this problem, because we do know what works and we know that it's possible. So joining me today is Lucina Meco, the co-founder of She Persisted Global, a cross-national initiative tackling this problem. We also have Shireen Mitchell, who is a self-described serial founder and a leader in digital advocacy. Nita Jankowicz, a former NDIer, I will mention, is also a fellow at the Wilson Center and the author of How to Lose the Information War and the forthcoming How to Be a Woman Online. And Muthoni Muriithi, who is the Senior Gender Policy Manager at the World Wide Web Foundation. So there is literally no better group to enlist all of you, our guests today, in solving this problem. And I really hope that's what we can do here today. We have 45 minutes, so it shouldn't be a problem. We can definitely fix it there. So let's start with Lucina. Can you tell us about what we know about where and how online violence is taking place against women.
Thank you so much, Moira. So here is what we know. First, this is a problem that is pervasive across borders and any countries, because really online violence against women, and particularly women in politics, is happening everywhere. According to a recent study from the Economist Intelligence Unit, over 85% of women globally have witnessed online violence and abuse. And actually the percentages go even higher in regions like Latin America, the Middle East, and Africa. And also, really, what we know is that these attacks are aimed at silencing and discrediting women and ultimately bringing them out of the public arena. So women journalists and politicians are really frequent targets. And the aim of these targets is really to silence them and stop them from speaking out. The attacks against Maria Ressa in the Philippines, taken to scale through online disinformation campaigns, are really a prime example of the aims of such efforts for those women that are in fact at the forefront of the battle against authoritarians. Similar things are happening in Germany to the candidate to the German elections. And really we see overall that even more broadly, beyond the attacks against the women politicians themselves, those attacks are really aimed at rolling back women's rights, silencing calls for good governance, and even interfere in foreign elections.
Thanks for that. And I'm going to move now to Shireen to put you on the spot with our favorite straw man question. And that is, isn't this just the price women pay? Isn't this just the price of doing business? And shouldn't women just accept that that there are going to be attacks? This is just the way the internet is. You're muted.
Just realized. Sorry about that. It's always interesting when I hear questions like that or statements like that, right? Because everyone experiences online harassment, right? That's the comment that most people come from with this debate. So it doesn't seem like it's a big deal when it happens to women. But what happens to women is very distinctly different, and particularly women of color. It isn't just an attack on them, it's an attack on their children. For Black women, one of the first attacks is to basically say, I hope your child doesn't become a hashtag. That's a death threat. That's a death threat to basically say, stop speaking, no matter what you're speaking about and no matter what the content is. And somehow they don't have the right to speak. Like, we want to define freedom of speech, but then we want to talk about the ways in which that is being held up on these platforms, as well as the way in which they're being targeted. So yeah, I mean, does everyone get some level of harassment? Yes. But what happens to women is not your average name calling. The death threats, if you were doing it in person, are not threats that would be acceptable. You would be arrested for doing. I don't know why you think you can do it online. Also, I don't know why platforms do not hold people accountable for the laws that already exist about death threats. But it does get couched every once in a while to, well, if you want to speak up, you have to deal with the way in which people will disagree with you. Disagreements are fine. This is not about disagreement. This is about incitement of violence. This is about harms that are being inflicted. This is about the fact that my voice should not be elevated because I disagree with you. But when I disagree with you, my life should be threatened for me daring to disagree with you. And that's what changes what's happening here. This is not your everyday thing, and no one should want to believe that anyone is speaking up or saying anything, that they should have the right to have themselves, have their lives threatened just because they're speaking up. What happens to freedom of speech? In this moment with women, you're basically saying, especially women of color, you don't have the right to speak up at all. And that the fact that you're even daring, you should accept that the fact that your life should be threatened. And I say no to that. What about you?
Absolutely. I think there are plenty of people on this who are behind you 100%. But I also want to point out, it's not just the sentiment, right? We have the facts that back this up. We know that this is disproportionately impacting women. And Nina, you did a report on this, and I'm wondering if you can kind of walk us through not just telling us that it happens, but the how it happens, because that's really at the heart of this issue of getting us through that it is a solvable problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Moira. Thank you, Shireen, Lucina, Muthoni. It's just an honor to be with you today. And my recycling truck agrees. That's coming right now. Always perfect timing for these online panels. Listen, the thing that was the most striking about the report that we released with the Wilson Center in January of this year, it's called Malign Creativity. It is all of the ways that abusers, which I think it's important that we call them that. They're not just internet users. This is a very deliberate behavior of abuse that is being targeted toward women. Abusers are so able to get around all of the loopholes they can exploit in terms of service. They get around platforms' blind spots, their lack of intersectional expertise in their content moderation and in their policies. Let's not forget that all of these social media platforms that we're using were built by and for cisgender white men. Right? They've had, until very recently, very few women in Silicon Valley. Now we're seeing that start to change, but we need to continue to push for that intersectional expertise, particularly in policymaking and content moderation enforcement. Now, getting back to the how, we see these abusers identify kind of a spot where they're getting dinged, right? If they're using the word bitch, rather than write the word bitch, they'll use an exclamation point for the I so that the automated, the AI doesn't pick up the fact that they're using that word. They use mimetic warfare. So rather than sending textual abuse, they'll send pictures. One that I've gotten frequently is, because I'm a woman in my 30s, the far right trolls who I get abusing me like to send me pictures of empty egg cartons saying, you shouldn't be in the public sphere. You shouldn't be doing this intellectual work. You should be at home making babies. And here's a reminder that your biological clock is ticking, because women are only good for one thing, and that's making babies. Another thing I was told is, you make babies, we build bridges, as if those two things are equitable. I'm sure many of those men would not survive childbirth. Let's just put it that way. But using these iterative mimetic types of abuse, they're able to escape enforcement. They're able to continue to push this vitriol at women. And when you're in the middle of it, as I'm sure everyone on this panel can attest to, it's like being in a swarm of bees. And to say that that does not have an offline effect on women is ludicrous. We walk around, you walk through a park at night, you have your keys in your hand, you're on the phone with someone, you take a route that goes under streetlights so that you'll be safe. And with that constant threat of physical violence, knowing what we know, that people are doxxed and swatted, disproportionately women on the internet, of course that feels like a physical threat. So this has follow-on effects, not only on women's political participation, but for our national security as well. We know that our adversaries around the world see this online misogyny as a fissure in our society that they can exploit. And unfortunately, our fellow citizens are giving them that fodder. We also see a lot of dogpiling, and I found that the terms of service on platforms really do not account for this effect. We see one high follower account say something that's not explicitly targeted harassment, that doesn't really go against the terms of service, but what it does is signal to all of those followers that this person is now a target, and that's when the really nasty stuff happens. So those are the two things that I think platforms really need to think creatively about how to address, because that is how abusers are evading the consequences of their actions.
I think that's well said. And I want to just make the point that I know we all believe. One is that all of us are accountable for solving this problem, right? That this is not a women's problem to solve, but every one of us who are participating in this event if we are interested in making the internet safe for democracy, it starts here, right? It starts with 50% of the population. And then as Shireen rightly pointed out, This is the key, to start there with a gender disaggregated research with, some of this focus opens up the opportunity for protection for marginalized communities of all types, right? So the idea here is being inclusive and making it an inclusive space for everyone. And I want to turn on that front to Muthoni, because the Web Foundation has done a lot of work in this space and really identified some opportunities for solution, and really taken a lot of the platforms to task for their actions, working with them, but also, pointing it out and not letting it slip away. So can you tell us a little bit about the work you've done and how we join you in fixing this?
Yes, definitely. So thank you so much for this panel. And I'm just going to pick up from where Nina left off, because I think it's really important for us to think of solutions. How do we start to fix this problem? And I think for the Web Foundation, we recognize that these are complex problems that require multifaceted approach. So for us, on our part, we looked at it from a multi-stakeholder perspective. How do we bring together women's rights organizations, women activists, together with tech companies, civil society organizations, to really think about what solutions could look like? I think one of the critiques we hear, and we've had them many times, it's not the first time, women have been saying this over and over on platforms, the ways in which they experience online harassment and abuse. And there was a sense that they were not being heard, or we are not being heard when we are giving back this information. So we decided to create an open dialogue between social media platforms, particularly Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Google, and Twitter, and to bring together women journalists, politicians, women activists, young women, to really start to think of what does the experience online look like? How can we start to solve for some of these problems? And I think this was an experiment on our part to see what happens when you put all these people in the room. Can we start to think about solutions? So from those consultations, two key challenges come out for us strongly. One, and has been already repeated, is that women express the need for greater control over who can comment or reply on their posts, as well as being able to have choice over what they see online, what they see, and how they see it, right? And then the second big challenge that came out, which is always mentioned, is that women highlighted that there needs to be an improved reporting system so that they can be better supported, and that they don't receive the violent and abusive content that usually comes on their timelines. So together with Feminist Internet and Craig Walker, Web Foundation created what we call a Tech Design Policy Lab. So this was a pilot, the first one that we've done as to find out whether this methodology works. And what it did is brought together design thinking methodologies, civil society organization, tech experts, with the idea of developing product solutions that would address these concerns around content moderation and privacy in a way that would give women control and autonomy over the platforms. So for us, some of the key recommendations that we're seeing and that we're advocating for is one, and I think Nina alluded to it, is that we need to start thinking about using what we're calling gender by design methodologies in developing products and services. And this enables us to really think of what are the impacts of the products of services on women experiences, and how can we design products that actually take into, as you rightly mentioned, the lived experiences online, their safety, their security, etc. Also, we advocate for tech companies to really think of consulting with women's rights activists. I think what was interesting about this exercise was the ways in which we don't often listen to women. We don't often listen to their experiences. And not only do we not listen to them, we don't consult them in developing. Women aren't consulted in developing products and services, which is such a basic thing. It's nothing new, really, but it's something that we have to emphasize over and over, that women need to be in the room. And I think you rightly pointed out, Moira, in really conducting regular gender audits of the products and services, and really collecting gender disaggregated data in a way that is transparent. So how can tech platforms and policies start to be transparent about the data in which they're collecting, and understanding how the products are working for women? So for us, a few things that we're pushing for. So one, around curation. So offering more granular settings for users. So who can see, share content, reply, post, making sure that that's actually set up in a way that women can use, set up in a way that is simple and accessible. We do recognize that oftentimes English is the dominant language or big European languages. So how can we ensure that people, especially the global South, women in the global South, are actually able to use and have a better experience online? Providing easy navigation and access to safety tools. I think Shireen mentioned it's so difficult sometimes to understand how one can navigate these tools. So making it more accessible. And I think this is really important, reducing the burden on women to, women always have to be the ones to make sure that they're safe online and take the precautions themselves. The platforms aren't proactively reducing the amount of abuse that they see. So I think this is something that we can start advocating for. In terms of reporting, I think one of the things is how to offer users the ability to track and manage their report. So once you make a report, what happens to it? How can you track it? How can you how do you get an update of where the report is at? Do you get feedback on that particular report? Enabling greater capacity to address context. So as I mentioned, not only global North, but global South context, but also context in the way that abuse happens. And I think Nina really alluded to that in terms of how can they better understand how abuse is happening online. And lastly, providing more policy and product guidance when reporting abuse. So how to be supported when you're trying to make a report online. So those are just some of the solutions that we're advocating for, and we hope that tech companies can really start to think deeply and start to develop with this gender design approach in mind. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that. And there's so much I want to this is such a great panel, and I want to give the opportunity to our participants to ask questions. So please ask them. But while we wait for that to happen, I want to underline one thing that you said, which really is the focus that we wanted to talk about today, is this idea of liability versus participation, right? That platforms are really looking at, how can I not be liable for a woman being doxxed online and, potentially having offline violence as the standard that they're looking at, which to me often feels like the equivalent of, did you have your keys out when you were walking through that dark alley? What were you wearing, right? Like, there's here are a host of tools that you can spend half your day putting on the platform, when I think there are examples out there that we can really design in a way that does make women feel safe. And I wonder if, I'll open it up to all of you, if you want to comment on that a little bit, of how we go about shifting that line from one of liability to one of a responsibility to make the participation space safe.
Yeah, very quickly, I think I want to say that, we need to switch from a mindset of looking at content, for example, or actions that are legal versus illegal, to really looking at a framework of online harms and duty of care. And so we see some of the UK legislation and the European Union legislation looking at that. And the reason that this framework works better is that it really dives into issues of risk assessment, dive into issues of transparency in how products are designed, that ultimately address a lot better a lot of the content that is often defined as lawful but awful. Because, for example, in the disinformation realm, lying is not illegal in very many countries. And however, the lies that women are targeted with, in fact, have very real consequences for them, for their lives, and can even be a matter of life or death. And there are three things, I think, three misunderstandings that have made it so that we haven't been able to get there yet more broadly. And I think that the number one really has been that so far we have understood this to be a problem for women only. And I say women only, unfortunately, even though women are 50% of the population, and therefore what's a problem for 50% of the population shouldn't be seen as a minor thing, but actually it is. And even so, this understanding is mistaken, because in fact, we do see that those online harms, that these disinformation campaigns are in fact also aimed at eroding democracy, eroding human rights, and are in fact a matter of national security, as Nina was saying. So number one, we need to broaden our understanding of the problem and its impacts. Number two, I think we need to look beyond misogyny and social norms. I think that platforms are happy to have us think that, you know, the problem is not them, it's not what they're doing, the problem is in society and social norms in society, and they didn't invent misogyny. Which is true, they did not invent misogyny, but they did invent, and they're still implementing, a product that is really incentivizing and rewarding hate, misogyny, misinformation as it generates profit for the social media companies through enhanced engagement. And therefore, they need to be held accountable for that product design, and they need to change the product design in such a way that it doesn't lead very naturally to those consequences. And third and last, I really think we have been, particularly in the US, held hostage by the conversation around freedom of speech. And it has been framed as if freedom of speech was in contradiction, in fact, with looking at further better platforms or even regulations for social media standards. In reality, those two things go hand in hand, because as we have seen today, women are not free today to express themselves online. The kind of concerns that they have to face when expressing themselves online are such that, in fact, they represent a very strong, limitation to their freedom of expression. And what we are asking here companies to do is not anything very different than what we're asking so many other industries to do. No, food industry would be allowed to put food in your plates that has poison in it. And then if something happens and someone dies, they just say, oops, we are sorry, and we're gonna try to do better next time. No, generally there are departments that go into the industries that produce that food and check how that food is made, what are the ingredients, have all steps being taken to make sure that something wrong doesn't happen down the line and that someone gets killed. That's the type of oversight that we do generally for many, many different industries, from those building bridges to, to food, to pharmaceutical. And we have allowed social media companies to really get away with murder in many cases, I would say, without having any of those check-ins and those accountability steps. So those are the things that I think really must be addressed.
I'm sorry about the background noise. Every time I open up to speak, a child comes in. I want to, Shireen, go to you, because I think we have a couple of questions coming in. So I want to give you a chance to speak, but also on one issue in particular, which came from the audience, which is that we're talking a lot about the online harms. It is the subject here, but can you also talk about how women have been enabled by the digital world, right? How women's rights have, I think it's worth us addressing the flip side question. So please feel free to continue this conversation, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that before I get to that, which I think is very important, is that, again, some of the parts of this conversation is about the technological frameworks that is, the utopic frame, right? That's, that using social media has elevated voices that were not able to be elevated before, and that we have an opportunity to talk in a way that, like, we don't need mainstream media, and that we can still, politicians get to use social media to get their stories out and their voices out, no matter which, platforms they decide to use, whether it's YouTube or Facebook or Twitter, and no matter what the medium happens to be, whether it's through that or text messaging. I mean, we can go through the list of all the elevation that these opportunities are about. But I do think that there's a couple of little key things about the fact that as they're doing that, they're being held accountable in a way that isn't accountable for everyone else, right? So one of the things they're saying is they have to be responsible for the actions that they take because they happen to be doing this, happen to be using these platforms. I also think that we want to make sure that despite the recommendations that we're hearing right now, is that these platforms are basically saying, we don't have to be accountable for you. You have to be accountable for yourself. That includes that in order for us to know that something bad is happening to you, you have to self-report. And when you have to self-report, that means that they are saying, well, we're not going to use our algorithms. We're not going to do anything else to make sure that you're safe. We're basically saying, you have to tell us bad things are happening to you. And there's a disproportionate framework in terms of that, in terms of who gets reported, how they get reported, and then how the platforms respond. I think that's the most important part. Do I agree that we're in an environment where we think freedom of speech is great? I also believe that we, as much as we say that, we also use it as a cudgel. We use it in a way that says, hey, we want to make sure everyone can say what they want, however they want. But even if they're inciting violence, even if they're producing death threats against women, particularly women of color, it is not our job to do anything about that. It is the women of color, it's the women who have to say, hey, that was a death threat. Did you not catch it on your platform? Do we not know that that's illegal? Do we not know there's laws against that? And that's what's different about where we are right now. I also think it's really important for people to understand that those distinctions, because those distinctions, it's not, again, name calling. It's not about disagreements. It is about the ways in which these platforms are basically saying it's okay for someone to threaten your life, threaten your children, and we won't take it down unless you complain about it. So if I don't complain about it and someone shows up at my doorstep, somehow it's my fault. And that's the key piece here that I think we're missing in terms of these conversations, because I think that people don't realize is that we aren't saying this isn't a platform that's giving us some level of elevation, which is great, some level of organizing and talking about issues that are important to us and finding community that wants to talk about these issues that are important to us as well. What we're saying is, as we're doing that, you're saying to us, with the way that you're responding, the platforms, others, that if we say while we're doing that, we're being harmed, we're being threatened, that somehow that's our responsibility. And we should somehow feel like that's the way of the world, or the road that we've decided to travel. And that, just very importantly, that we, speaking up against the harms against us, sexism, racism, whatever list you want to give, that somehow we are the ones that are more problematic than those that are inflicting the harms against us, those who are being racist, those who are being sexist. And we're defending ourselves against that. And somehow we should be okay with how we're being treated while we're trying to defend ourselves and protect our families and ourselves at the same time.
I think that's such an important point, and it leads into a question that we got for Nina, which is about, you referenced the gray area, but as Shireen pointed out, like, this is a pretty big gray area in terms of the terms of service. And, you know, one of the things as you were talking about, Shireen, that jumped out at me is in Malign Creativity, in the report Nina did, there's this amazing graph of, you know, the attacks on Ilhan Omar, you know, that just, the minute like the brigading, the just the spike, for everything she says. And it looks identical to ones of research we've done in the Philippines, research we've done in other, I mean, it's just like, it couldn't be more obvious in terms of a gray area. But can you go into some detail about what are the steps, what are the fixes a platform like Facebook, we'll pick on Facebook because in a lot of the world, that's the internet. And, you know, what are the fixes that they need to address to get at this gray area, not just for women, but for marginalized communities, people of color, LGBT, you know, all marginalized populations?
Yeah, so in the report, we have a long section, I think, with 7 top-line recommendations for platforms. And you're right, Facebook is the internet in many of the countries that we're talking about. I would also say, you know, a lot of this abuse was happening on Twitter for the candidates that we were looking at. And that's because a lot of politics happens on Twitter. But also we found in comparing activity on Twitter to other platforms, abusers prefer to yell at their targets rather than just about them. So when they can actually reply someone or comment on a post, we saw that happening on Twitter a lot, but that doesn't absolve, culpability from platforms like Reddit, 4chan, 8kun, Gab, Parler. They all have really, really toxic and disgusting problems there as well. So what do they need to do? One, I think it's really important, and we've talked about reporting structures. Muthoni and Shireen both touched on this. We are advocating for a incident report to be introduced so that women can create kind of a 40,000 foot view with context about an incident of dogpiling or a campaign against them. That would allow us to note, okay, here's the tweet or the piece of content that incited this, and here's everything that stemmed from it. Or here's all of the context that you as a content moderator need to understand, rather than this myopic view where a tweet in and of itself might not be necessarily against the terms of service, but when you view it as part of a whole, when you're in the middle of that storm of insects, it definitely is part of that targeted harassment campaign against you. So that's number one. Number two, we're advocating for platforms to take a more proactive view of updating their classifiers for their automated systems. So reaching out to political candidates, to high-profile women, to women who are perhaps not high profile, but in the middle of a strange spike in activity, which you better bet your butt that the platforms can see on their end. They can see when suddenly a bunch of accounts that aren't following someone are suddenly, spamming them with unpleasant content. Talking to those women and saying, what are the types of things these people are saying to you? This allows the platforms to get a little bit ahead of malign creativity, of that mimetic warfare and the iterative content to try to avoid detection, so that when they're using, the exclamation point in the word bitch, we can get ahead of that and anticipate it and continue to catch that stuff before it happens or as it's happening, rather than making the onus be on women for reporting that content. And then thirdly, I mentioned this before, I think it is so critical not only to make sure that policy staff who are developing the taxonomies for these different content moderation policies, but also kind of interfacing with governments, et cetera, that these are representative of intersectional identities across race, across sexuality, across different economic backgrounds, et cetera. That is incredibly important that they be representative so that they can anticipate the types of threats that women are going to receive. A great one recently where you can tell there was no woman in the room when this was rolled out was when Slack decided to introduce direct messaging to any user on the platform just based on a name. Well, what about people who have abusive exes who are suddenly able to direct message them on their work platform? What a disaster, right? So that sort of thing is incredibly important, along with introducing better working conditions and sensitivity training for content moderators, the people who are, executing these decisions basically in sweatshop-like conditions around the world. We need to empower them to really make better, more informed, sensitive decisions about the content that they're moderating. Those are my top three.
I mean, we've got a great list here, and Muthoni and everyone has given the general list of things that we can do to fix this. But I want to ask Muthoni, do you think that there is the will to do it, either in the platforms and governments? And so, I mean, do you think it's there? This is so obvious to all of us. Why isn't it happening?
Tough question. Well, that's not a tough question, but I think, that's the biggest challenge, right? Of all the solutions we've said here, there aren't new solutions. There are many people providing these solutions. So the question is a valid one. Why aren't these solutions being adopted? And I think there is a challenge of political will, but we are seeing some changes, at least with the tech companies that we've engaged with. We are seeing a willingness to partake in dialogue and in trying to find solutions, and then adopting some of the actually points that Nina has raised about making sure that, not only are you designing products that are, dealing with women's experiences, but you actually hire people who understand and have this lived experience to be able to inform your decisions internally. I think the question here is, how can we hold them accountable? I think this is it. How do we hold them accountable on the commitments that they make? And I think that's what we at the Web Foundation are aiming to do. We have stretched out, we've gone out, we've created the multi-stakeholder conversations. Now, what we want to see is how they will take on these recommendations moving forward, and we will be holding them accountable to that. So I think when it comes to tech companies, currently we're in a wait and see. But I think when it comes to governments, we're also seeing similar challenges where we're not seeing legislation that's moving fast enough to be able to address how to address online gender-based violence. We are seeing some progress in countries where the World Foundation has partners. But again, it's slow because the problem is similar to what we would consider offline gender-based violence, right? With the implementation, there's nothing new here. Like in the ways in which we understand violence against women globally, and the slow pace at which governments have often reacted to that phenomena is similar, probably even worse when it comes to online gender-based violence. So I think the challenge for us is really how do we agitate, how do we keep on finding multifaceted strategies? How can we continue to be innovative to be able to hold everyone accountable? So tech companies accountable, but also governments accountable, because there's a sense that this isn't a problem for states, right? There's a sense that this is not our problem. This is a problem that happens on the platforms. And I think there's a need to take on governments and really ask them to invest in not only shifting social norms, as Lucina pointed out, but also in seeing how to enable policy and legislative frameworks for change. So that's what I would say.
Well said, and we are closing in on time, and I will say, like at NDI, we completely agree. Madeline Albright, who chairs our board, has made this a major issue to develop a solution summit around it for this year, so we'll be working on it. But rapidly, I want everybody to just run through what can this group do? The digital Sherlocks we have joining us today. I will start, which is that I don't want to see any reports coming out that don't have a gender disaggregated data and gender disaggregated research. I don't care if it's on Hong Kong activists or, a legal framework. Just talk about gender and marginalized communities for like one paragraph in anything that you're doing. We'll go, Lucina, you're next, and just quick through this group.
Yeah, I want us all to fight so that the digital platform standards that are being designed take into account women, that women are actually leading those conversations. We know if you're not at the table, you are on the menu, and we can no longer afford to be on the menu.
Okay, Shireen.
You're on mute.
My thing. Sorry about that. I would definitely agree with that. But I would also say that when it comes down to some of these problems, I've been in some of these rooms and not everyone's listening to us when we show up because they don't see us as a valuable part of this discussion, and understanding what happens to us is different than what happens to everyone else, and being able to be able to not only hold the companies accountable, but also government. Like even our government is not being able to sort of see the harms that are against us, because they're sort of in some ways participating in America in some of the same harms. And that we need to be able at the table in government as well as at the table at these tech companies. And we don't, if you know the numbers, and we've seen those numbers, they're like, 0.02% of Black women that exist. So I'm certain that we're not getting the answers that we need. And then the last thing I'll just say really quickly in terms of solution, if you see something happening to a Black woman, you should also take action and figure out a way to also help protect them. Like a lot of this fight feels like we're isolated and we're alone. And I think most people see these type of pylons, these activities, and there's something that everyday people can do as well. And you should take action as well.
Nina, 30 seconds, and then Muthoni.
Report and support. When you see this stuff happening online, piggybacking on what Shireen said, you can report it. That gives the platform algorithms a clue that something bad is happening. It helps. And then express your support. This is an extremely strange, lonely experience when it's happening to you. It helps to hear from people who are supporting you online.
Muthoni?
For me, it's let's ask who's not in the room. So I think who's not in the room is marginalized communities, especially in the global South. So I think that needs to be something we prioritize and make sure it's front and center into this discussion, because the power doesn't lie there, right? So I think that's something really interesting that we can all do to make sure that every time we have a space, we're pulling in others into the room to bring in solutions and to create solidarity to be able to change this phenomenon.
Well, there you have it, 360 participants. The problem is solved. I want to thank all of our participants, and we expect to see all of you in this fight. And with that, I will pass it back to the studio.